Good day everyone, this is Figues from Group 3 and we will be discussing the pelvic cavity of SAS 16. So contents of the pelvic cavity. This is my topic overview. First and foremost, what is pelvic cavity? So the pelvic cavity or cavity of the true pelvis can be defined as the area between the pelvic inlet and the pelvic outlet, as you can see in this illustration. It is customary to subdivide it with the pelvic diaphragm into the main pelvic cavity above and the perineum below. Contents of the pelvic cavity: sigmoid colon. Its location and description is: the sigmoid colon is 10 to 15 inches long and begins as a continuation of the descending colon in front of the pelvic brim. Next is blood supply. The arteries, sigmoid branches of the inferior mesenteric artery, which can be seen here in this area. The veins drain into the inferior mesenteric vein, which joins the portal venous system. The lymph drains into the nodes along the course of the sigmoid arteries. From these nodes, the lymph travels to the inferior mesenteric nodes. So the nerve supply is from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves from the inferior hypogastric plexuses. Next, all about the rectum. Its location and description is: the rectum is about 5 inches centimeter long, or 5 inches or 13 centimeter long, and begins in front of the third sacral vertebra as a continuation of the sigmoid colon. As you can see in my illustration about the sagittal section of the male pelvis, here you can see the sigmoid colon color sky blue, here the peritoneum color sky blue too, and the rectum color brown. So this one, the peritoneum, is which it covers the interior and lateral surfaces of the first third of the rectum and only the anterior surface of the middle third, leaving the lower third devoid of peritoneum. So the rectum has posterior and anterior relations. So anteriorly in the male, the upper 2/3 of the rectum, which is covered by the peritoneum, is related to the sigmoid colon and coils of ileum that occupy the rectal vesicle pouch here in this area. Next, the blood supply. The superior, middle, and inferior rectal arteries supply the rectum. Here you can see the superior rectal artery. So, the superior rectal artery is a direct continuation of the inferior mesenteric artery and is the chief artery supplying the mucous membrane. They anastomose with one another and with the middle and inferior rectal arteries. Here in this area is the middle rectal artery. It is a small branch of internal iliac artery and is distributed mainly in the muscular coat. And here is the inferior rectal artery, which is a branch of internal pudendal artery in the perineum. It anastomoses with the middle rectal artery at the anorectal junction. So the veins of the rectum correspond to the arteries. The lymph vessels of the rectum drain first into the pararectal nodes and then into the inferior mesenteric nodes. The nerve supplies from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves from the inferior hypogastric plexuses. So always remember that the rectum is sensitive only to stretch. Thank you for listening. Up next, pelvic viscera in male.
So now I'll be discussing about the pelvic cavity of the female, the ureter and the urinary bladder. The contents of the interior part of the pelvic cavity in the females are the following. We'll first discuss about the ureter. We'll be talking about its location and action. The ureter crosses over the pelvic inlet in front of the bifurcation of the common iliac artery. It runs downward and backward in front of the internal iliac artery and behind the ovary until it reaches the region of the ischial spine. It turns forward and medially beneath the base of the broad ligament where it is crossed by the uterine artery. Then, the ureter runs forward, lateral to the lateral fornix of the vagina to enter the bladder. Next is the urinary bladder. We'll be talking about its location and action. The urinary bladder is found immediately behind the pubic bones. The neck rests directly on the upper surface of the urogenital diaphragm. The close relation of the bladder to the uterus and the vagina is of the considerable clinical importance. The apex of the bladder lies behind the symphysis pubis. The base or posterior surface is separated by the vagina from the rectum. The superior surface is related to the uterovesical pouch of the peritoneum and to the body of the uterus. The inferolateral surfaces are related in front of the retropubic pad of fat and pubic bones. More posteriorly, they lie in contact with the obturator internus muscle above the levator ani muscle below. The general shape and structure of the bladder, its blood supply, lymph drainage, and nerve supply, and the process of micturition are the same to those of the male.
Good day, my name is Angel Gorgod and my topic for today is the male genital organ. So the male genital organ has vas deferens, ejaculatory ducts, a seminal vesicle, prostate, prostatic urethra, and visceral pelvic fascia. So the male reproductive system is largely external to the body. The penis, scrotum, and testicles are examples of external organs. So the vas deferens, prostate, and urethra are examples of internal organs. The male reproductive system is in charge of both sexual function and urine. First, we have the vas deferens. So, is a long muscular tube that travels from the epidermis, as you can see in the picture, into the pelvic cavity to just behind the bladder. The vas deferens transport mature sperm to the urethra in preparation for ejaculation. Next, we have here the seminal vesicle and ejaculatory ducts. So the seminal vesicle, also known as the vesicular or seminal glands, are a pair of glands found in the male pelvis, which function to produce many of the constituent ingredients of semen. They ultimately provide around 70% of the total volume of semen. We have here also the ejaculatory ducts. These ducts are formed by the fusion of the vas deferens and the seminal vesicle. The ejaculatory ducts empty into the urethra. The urethra is the tube that carries urine from the bladder to the outside of your body. Next, we have the prostate. As you can see in the picture, we have here the circle. So that is an organ in male reproductive system. Anatomy. This small gland sits directly below the bladder and plays a role producing and fine-tuning semen. The prostate has various functions. The most important is producing seminal fluid, a fluid that is component of semen. Next, we have the prostatic urethra and visceral pelvic fascia. So the prostatic urethra is the portion of the urethra that transverses the prostate. It originates in the region of the bladder neck, courses roughly 2.5 cm inferiorly, and terminates at the membranous urethra. So the visceral pelvic fascia. The visceral pelvic fascia is a condensation of connective tissue that arises from the parietal fascia laterally. It provides an investing capsule for the pelvic organs and also the perineural and perivascular sheaths. Next, we have the peritoneum. So the peritoneum serves to support the organs of the abdomen and acts as a conduit for the passage of nerves, blood vessels, and lymphatics. So although the peritoneum is thin, it is made of two layers with a potential space between them. Our peritoneum is the tissue that lines your abdominal wall and covers most of the organs in your abdomen. A liquid peritoneal fluid lubricates the surface of the tissue. Next, we have the last slide for the male genital organs. Overall, they produce, maintain, and transport sperm, the male reproductive cells, and semen, the protective fluid around sperm. They discharge sperm into the female reproductive tract. They produce and secrete male sex hormones. Next, our topic is the female genital organs. So, the female genital organs has vagina, visceral, pelvic fascia, and peritoneum. Alright? So, the female reproductive system is divided into two parts. The uterus, which houses the growing fetus, secretes vaginal and uterine fluids and transport anatomically male sperm to the fallopian tubes, and the ovaries, which generate anatomically female egg cells. So we have here the vagina, as you can see in the picture. It's a tube-like muscular but elastic organ, about 2 to 5 inches long in an adult woman. It connects the external genital organs to the uterus. The vagina is the organ of sexual intercourse in women. So we have here the visceral, pelvic fascia, and peritoneum. So the endopelvic part of the pelvic fascia is continued over the various pelvic visceral to form for them fibrous coverings. So in the female, this is perforated, or rather perforated by the vagina. Its posterior portion passes to the side of the uterine. It forms a loose strand of the rectum, but is firmly attached around the anal canal. This portion is known as the rectal layer. A layer of tissue supports the ovaries of fallopian tubes, that is the peritoneum. This tissue is called the peritoneum. In men and women, the inner layer of the peritoneum covers the surface of all the organs in the tummy or the abdomen, such as the stomach, liver, and bowel. The outer layer lines the wall of the abdomen.
Hi, this is Figues once again, and I'm going to tackle one of the female genital organs, the ovary. So, its location and description is: each ovary is oval-shaped, measuring 1.5 times 0.75 inches, and is attached to the back of the broad ligament by the mesoovarium, as you can see here in the illustration. So the position of the ovary is, however, extremely variable, and it is often found hanging down in the recto-uterine pouch of Douglas. So take note that before puberty, the ovary is smooth, but after puberty, the ovary becomes progressively scarred as excessive corpora lutea degenerate. After menopause, the ovary becomes shrunken and its surface is pitted with scars. Next is the function of the ovary. So its function is: it is responsible for the production of the female germ cells, the ova, and the female sex hormones, the estrogen and the progesterone, in the sexually mature female. Next is the blood supply. So the ovarian artery arises from the abdominal aorta at the level of the first lumbar vertebra, and the ovarian vein drains into the inferior vena cava on the right side and into the left renal vein on the left side. The lymph vessels of the ovary follow the ovarian artery and drain into the para-aortic nodes at the level of the first lumbar vertebra. So, the nerve supply of the ovary is derived from the aortic plexus and accompanies the ovarian artery. So that would be all for this part. Reminder: the blood supply, lymph drainage, and the nerve supply of the ovary pass over the pelvic inlet and cross the external iliac vessels. They reach the ovary by passing through the lateral end of the broad ligament, the part known as the suspensory ligament of the ovary. Up next, uterine tube.
So now we'll be discussing about the female genital organs, the uterine tube and the uterus. First up is the uterine tube. We'll be talking about its description, parts, and functions. The two uterine tubes are each about 4 inches long and lie in the upper border of the broad ligament. Each tube is connected to the peritoneal cavity in the region of the ovary with the cavity of the uterus. Now we'll be discussing about the 4 parts of the uterine tube. First up is the infundibulum. It has a funnel-shaped lateral end that projects beyond the broad ligaments and overlies the ovary. At the free edge of the funnel are several finger-like processes draped over the ovary called fimbriae. Next is the ampulla. It is the widest part of the tube. The third one is the isthmus, narrowest part of the tube just lateral to the uterus. And lastly is the intramural part, the segment that pierces the uterine wall. Now let's discuss the functions of the uterine tube. It receives the ovum from the ovary and provides a site where fertilization of the ovum can take place, usually in the ampulla. Provides no nourishment for the fertilized ovum and transport it to the cavity of the uterus. Serves as a conduit along which the spermatozoa travel to reach the ovum. Next is the uterus. We'll be talking about its description, parts, function, position, and structure. The uterus is a hollow pear-shaped organ with thick muscular walls. In young adult, it measures 3 inches long and 2 inches wide and 1 inch thick. Parts of the uterus. First up is the fundus. It is part of the uterus that lies above the entrance of the uterine tubes. Next is the body. It is a triangular and coronal section but merely a cleft in the sagittal plane. Lastly is the cervix. It is the narrowest part of the uterus. Function of the uterus. The uterus serves as a site for the reception, retention, and nutrition of the fertilized ovum. Position of the uterus. In most women, the long axis of the uterus is bent forward and the long axis of the vagina called anteversion of the uterus. In the erect position and the bladder empty, the uterus lies in an almost horizontal plane. In some women, the fundus and body of the uterus are bent backward on the vagina. Here it is said to be retroverted. If it is bent backward on the cervix, it is said to be retroflexed. Structure of the uterus. The uterus is covered with peritoneum. Its muscular wall or myometrium is thick and made up of smooth muscles supported by the connective tissue. The endometrium, a mucous membrane, line the body of the uterus. From puberty to menopause, the endometrium undergoes extensive changes during the menstrual cycle in response to the ovarian hormones.